Hello and welcome to a new video tutorial on YouTube channel of tutorialspedia.com. This video tutorial is part of a series of video tutorials covering different topics related to MuleSoft. In this tutorial, we will see MuleSoft flows and subflows, and we are going to analyze attributes and variable scopes by using the flow reference to a subflow, and then we are going to use VM connector to see that how attributes and variables are propagated to the subflows or the secondary flows when we are having a transport barrier in between. So here is a bit of more detail of the topics that are part of this video tutorial. We are going to create a Mule4 project which will have a main flow and we will have a subflow. We will first invoke the subflow from the main flow using the flow reference. So in this scenario, we will have a subflow in the same execution sequence and in the same thread. And we will see that how attributes and variables that are being transferred from the main flow to the subflow and how the propagation happens. And once we receive it in the subflow, and if there are any changes that are made to the variables in the subflows, how it's going to be propagated and reflected back in the main flow. And then we will make a little more enhancement and change, and instead of calling a subflow using the flow reference, we will see that how attributes and variable scopes differ when we pass the transport barrier. So in that case we will be using VM connector. So using the VM connector, we will be having VM publish consume operation in our main flow, and in our second flow we will have a VM listener. And once we receive the request in the VM listener based flow, we will make some changes to the variables, and then we will observe and we will see that is it going to be reflected back in the main flow or not. So let's now jump into the implementation part without further ado. I have already opened Anypoint Studio. I'm going to create a new project. I will choose File, New, and I'll create a new project. And let's name this project as Scope Analysis Mule4, and just click on Finish button. So once you will click on Finish, your project will get created and you will be able to see the project structure in the Package Explorer. And by default, it creates one flow with the same name as your project name. As you can see here, Scope Analysis Mule4.xml. So let's first create the main flow. For the main flow, we are going to add a HTTP listener. That will be the source, as we will be receiving the request in the form of HTTP request. And let's rename this flow to main flow. Okay, so in the main flow, we need to configure this HTTP listener. So I'll click on HTTP listener. And here in the connector configuration, I'm going to click on this plus button. And we are going to make, if we need to make any changes for the host and port, by default, it listens on port 8081 with the host name as 0.0.0.0, which is the local host. In our case, if port 8081 is available, we don't need to make any changes. But in case if you have 8081 already in use in your system, then you can, of course, use any of the available ports. So I'll keep it as is and just click on OK. And for the path, I'm going to use /test scope. And just we will save it. And now next what we are going to do is that we are going to add a set variable in because we want to save some variables. Whatever I will receive in the query parameter in the ID, I want to save that in this variable. Let's name the variable as v_test. And for the value, we will have to switch to expression mode. And I'm going to use attributes dot query params dot id. So we will be expecting a query parameter with the name id, and whatever the value comes in this query parameter, we are going to save that in this v_test variable. Now after setting this variable, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just add a logger, because we want to log some information and we want to track that whatever has been logged from the main flow and whatever we will log from the subflow, how the values of these attributes, how the values of these variables are going to be changed and reflected. So here I'm going to write variable value in main flow, and I'm going to concatenate vars.v_test to refer to the variable value as string. Alright. So in this way, we are going to have our first logger activity in the main flow, and after this, we will be calling a subflow. And in the for this case, we will use a flow reference. But let's first create the subflow. So let's add a new subflow, and we will add it underneath, and let's rename it to just subflow. And in the subflow, what I'm going to do two things. I want to observe first that the attribute value, does it get saved in the subflow? I mean, if the attributes are getting propagated to the subflow or not. And secondly, what we will do is that we will make some changes to the variable in the subflow, same variable as we set in the main flow. And we want to observe that if we make any changes in the subflow, is it going to be reflected in the main flow or not? And in that way, we will be able to assess the scope of variables and attributes in the main flow and the subflow when a subflow is called using a flow reference. So first of all, in the subflow, we are going to in the subflow we are going to add the set variable operation. So we will use set variable, and we are going to drag and drop it to the subflow. And here we are going to use the same variable v underscore test, and for this now we want to access the value dot id, and we want to just save it to the variable. After this, what we want to do is that we want to add a logger in the subflow. Okay, so I will add a logger in the subflow, and here we are going to write a message. Let me copy the message from the main flow. I'll make a few changes to this message in the subflow. First, we need to change it to expression mode, and then I will write variable value in subflow, and the value will be var v underscore test, whatever the value is there. So in this way, once we log it in the subflow, we are expecting that the message should contain this information plus the same value as we have in the main flow. Okay, so after this, what we are going to do is that in the main flow we are going to use the flow reference. So I will add a flow reference after the logger, and in the flow reference, in the flow for the flow name in the drop down, I'm going to choose subflow. So we are going to call subflow from the main flow. Okay, so now in this way, in the main flow, first we are setting the variable based on the attribute value. Then we are having a logger where we are logging the message, and then we have a flow reference. After the flow reference, I'm going to have logger activity again, and I want to log the value based on the call to the flow to the subflow, and I want to observe is the value going to change or not. So I'll just paste it, and I will write variable in value in main flow after calling subflow. So we want to see that what is the change to the value of this variable once we have called the subflow. So for now we will keep it like this. Only we will observe the behavior of attributes and the variables based on this invocation, and then we will do the next step of our tutorial where we will add a VM connector. So let's run this project. It will take some time to get loaded, and once it's running, then we will hit a request from the postman. So our project is deployed. As you can see the status here in the console. Now I'll go to my postman, which I will be using as a client, and let me just clear it up. Localhost :8081/test scope (ID is equal to whatever value I want to pass. So I'll just hit the service, I should be receiving back this response. Since we did not add any payload, so the response is blank, but we already received the request, and let's observe the logs. So now if you see here, variable value in main flow is 345 because the query ID parameter was having the value 345. Variable value in the subflow is also 345. So from here you observe that the attributes have been propagated to the subflow, because in the subflow we were referring to the same attribute which we have in the main flow. And then variable value in the main flow after calling subflow is 345. So now we want, since we set the values same value, we are not sure that this value is propagated from the subflow or the value is from the main flow. So let's make a little change. In the subflow, we are going to +1. We are going to have a +1 to the value, so that we may observe that the value got changed in the subflow or not. So it will be reloaded automatically. Now let's try. Okay, so we tried again. Now if you see, the value in main flow was 345. Then variable value in the subflow, we accessed the attribute value which was 345. We added +1, so it was 346. And variable value in the main flow after calling the subflow is 346. This means that whatever changes you do in the subflow, they are propagated back to the main flow. So any changes that you make to a variable in subflow, those changes will be propagated back to the main flow, and once the execution continues to the next step after the flow reference, those values will be propagated and will be available in the main flow. So this means that whenever we are going to use a subflow and a flow reference in the same execution plan or in the same thread, whatever attributes we have in the main flow, since we did not pass the transport boundary in this case, as the subflow was called using a flow reference, so without passing the transport boundary, we were able to pass the attributes as well as the variables to the subflow, and any changes made in the subflow are being observed back in the main flow. Now let's do the second change. What we are going to do is that after this, we are going to have another flow. We will add another flow. And here in this flow, for the source, we are going to add a VM listener. For that, first we will have to use this add module option. And here we will have to add a virtual machine VM module. So we will drag and drop it here. And now it becomes available. And we will use this VM listener. VM module, if you're not aware or if you're not familiar with this VM module, this virtual machine module is mainly used for as a messaging for queuing mechanism, and it also helps you to achieve asynchronous communication because it has the publisher, it has publish and consume. If you use publish and consume, then it will be expecting a response in the same synchronous fashion. But if you use publisher, then in the main flow it doesn't wait for the second flow, and it just it sends the request or sends the payload or whatever the request it is to the queue, and then in the separate execution plan or in a separate thread, your listener based flow continues to execute, and your main flow also moves to the next activity. But in our case, what we are going to use, we are going to use publish and consume. We will use publish consume. So in this case, it will be waiting for the response from the second flow, which is based on the listener. So here we have to make some configuration for our listener. First, we will click on this in the connector configuration. We will click on this plus button, and for the general, we are going to use edit inline. And here we are going to specify the queue name. We will click on plus button, and we will give it a name. Let's name it as test underscore queue, and just we will keep it queue type as transient, which is in memory, as we don't want persistent. As the scope of this tutorial is not to cover the VM connector in detail, I will make a separate video for different operations available in the VM connector in some other video. But in this video, we will keep it simple. So we will just use it to understand the scope of the attributes and variable instead of going into the nitty-gritties and details of the VM connector itself. So we are not going to make any other changes. We will click on OK button. And now what we are going to do is that for the queue name, we are going to click on refresh, and you can see, you will see that the test queue that we created is automatically reflected over here. Okay, so without making any further changes, now what we are going to do is that we are going to do the similar things. We are going to add a set variable, and we are going to use the logger. So let's add a set variable operation here. So now here we want to set a variable with the same name v underscore test to observe that how it's going to reflect in this case. So one important thing is that in this case, we don't have those attributes propagated. If you see here attributes, we don't have those HTTP attributes anymore available in this flow because we already passed the transportation boundary. So it's passing when we have a listener based flow, it's not similar as we have a flow reference, as we have a different transport and different transport boundary here. So the attributes are not getting propagated. So we cannot use attributes dot query name that query params dot whatever id we have in the previous scenario. So this means that in this case we cannot use that same as we did before. So what we will do, we will add a hard coded value 555. So in this case we don't need to have it in the form of expression. We can make it simple, and then we are going to add a logger. And now once we add a logger here, for the logger I want to copy the message same as the other cases. I'll just make a little change in the text. So here in the logger, I'm going to switch the message to the expression mode, and I will write it as variable value in VM listener based, and the value that I want to print is of the same v underscore test variable. In this case, it should be 555, which we hard coded. Now what we want to achieve and what we want to observe in this scenario is that once we set the value here as 555 and we log it, now once we are going to call this flow from the main flow and using the publish consume, and once the flow execution is returned back to the main flow, is the value going to be changed in the main flow as well or not? That's what we want to observe here. So in the main flow, I want to add publish consume after this logger. And here in this publish consume, the connector is already selected, and for the queue we are going to just click on this refresh. It should select test underscore queue, and we are not going to make any other changes here. And once we have invoked our VM listener based flow, after that we are going to add another logger, and we want to see what value we have for our variable. So here we are going to paste and variable value in main flow after calling VM flow. So in this way, what we are doing is that we are using the power of logger activity and logger operation to observe the attributes and variable values at different steps. Of course, if you run it in debug mode, that way you can directly observe the values for all of these flows and subflows. But instead of running in debug mode, I'm running it in the normal run mode and observing the behavior and observing the values of attributes and variables using the logger. So now let's observe by running this project. I think it's already running. I will have to stop it, although it automatically loads, but I want to run it again, a fresh run. So now it will run, and once it is running, I will hit the service from the postman once again, and we will observe that how the value is getting propagated and how we see a difference in scenarios where we are using a VM connector with by passing the transport boundaries when calling from the main flow. So the project status is now deployed. Let's go to the postman and try to hit it. This time I will change the parameters. from 345 to, let's add it, change it to 355, and just send the request. So the request is going to the server, and once the request is successful, then we will go to the console and we will observe the results. So we can see that we received a response, although it's a blank response, but we received a response with the status code 200. And now let's see and observe the behavior. So variable value, you can see in the main flow was 355. Then in the subflow, since we added it, incremented it with 1, so it's 356. And value in the main flow after calling the subflow is 356 because the value got propagated from the subflow to the main flow. And then what we did, we called another flow using the VM publish consume, and the subflow, that flow is having VM listener as its source, and there we hard coded the values to 555. But here you will observe that once the flow is returned to the main flow after the publish consume, the value is still 356. This means that any changes that you do in for the variable in that flow which is being invoked using the VM connector, that change doesn't get propagated back to the main flow. The reason is that in this case we are already crossing the transport boundaries, and once we cross the transport boundaries in this scenario, any changes in that flow which is based on the VM listener, the variable is not variable is considered as a separate variable over there, and the changes that we make to the variable values over there doesn't get reflected back to the main flow. So that's it from this video, and I hope that for a simple, very basic type of flow, this information that I conveyed to you is helpful. I didn't go into the advanced topics and advanced stuff related to the VM connector as well as the flows, because the purpose of this tutorial was just to elaborate on the scope and analyze the scope of the variables and attributes whenever we are using the subflows. So at the end, for the further reading, I will always refer you to two of the main sources which I always refer. One is official MuleSoft documentation, as you will find plenty of information on all the connectors and all the implementation approaches and best practices. And secondly, I will also refer you to the MuleSoft tutorials playlist on tutorialspedia.com YouTube channel where you are right now, and you will find plenty of videos on different topics. Thank you very much. I'll get back to you with some more videos in future. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon. Bye bye for now.